Podcast host Ryan Carter set out to challenge Clint Eastwood's conservative ideals, confident he could expose them as relics of the past. Instead, Clint's powerful words turned the tables, leaving Ryan stunned and rethinking everything. It was a crisp autumn morning in Los Angeles. Inside a sleek, glass-walled studio downtown, Ryan Carter, a millennial podcast host, was preparing for what he called the interview of the year. Ryan wasn't just any host. He was the voice of The Modern Lens, a podcast that had become wildly popular among millennials and Gen Z. Known for his sharp wit and progressive takes, Ryan had built a reputation for challenging traditional thinkers and calling out what he saw as outdated values. Today, his guest was none other than Clint Eastwood. Yes, that Clint Eastwood, the Hollywood legend, the man who had defined an era of cinema with his rugged characters and no-nonsense attitude. But Clint wasn't just a movie star. He was also a man of strong convictions, someone who had never been afraid to speak his mind, even when it wasn't popular. Ryan had been vocal about his disagreements with Clint's views. On a recent episode, he'd even called Clint's films a relic of a bygone era and accused him of promoting toxic masculinity. So when Clint's team reached out saying he was willing to come on the show, Ryan was stunned. Why would Clint Eastwood, a man who rarely gave interviews, agree to sit down with someone who had openly criticized him? Ryan didn't know, but he wasn't about to pass up the opportunity. The studio was buzzing with energy. Neon lights cast a cool blue glow over the room, and the sound of last-minute adjustments filled the air, microphones being tested, cameras being positioned, and producers whispering into headsets. Ryan sat at the head of the table, his signature coffee mug in hand. He was dressed sharply as always in a tailored blazer and a crisp white shirt. Across from him sat Clint Eastwood, calm and composed, wearing a simple button-down shirt and a weathered leather jacket. The contrast between the two men was striking. Ryan, with his polished, tech-savvy vibe, represented the modern world, fast-paced, ever-changing, and unapologetically progressive. Clint, on the other hand, was the embodiment of old-school grit and wisdom, a man who had seen the world change more times than most people could count. The cameras rolled and the interview began. "Welcome back to The Modern Lens," Ryan began, his voice smooth and practiced. "Today we have a very special guest. He's a Hollywood icon, a legend in every sense of the word, and someone who's been at the center of some pretty heated debates lately. Ladies and gentlemen, Clint Eastwood." Clint nodded politely. "Oh, thanks for having me, Ryan." Ryan leaned forward, a slight smirk on his face. "I'll admit, Clint, when my team suggested inviting you, I wasn't sure you'd say yes. You've been pretty vocal about your, let's say, traditional views. And I know this show doesn't exactly align with them." Clint didn't flinch. "Well, Ryan, I've never been one to shy away from a conversation. Besides, I figure it's good for folks to hear different perspectives every now and then." Ryan's smirk widened. He was ready for this. He'd done his homework, prepared his questions, and rehearsed his arguments. This was his chance to challenge one of Hollywood's most iconic figures, to prove that the old ways of thinking no longer had a place in the modern world. He decided to start with a direct question. "Clint, you've been in the spotlight for over half a century, and your films, while undeniably iconic, have been criticized for promoting outdated values. Some say they glorify a version of masculinity that's frankly harmful in today's world. What do you say to that?" Clint leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but thoughtful. "I'd say those folks are missing the point. My films aren't about promoting anything. They're about telling stories. Stories about people who face challenges, make tough choices, and stand for something bigger than themselves. If that's outdated, then maybe we've got bigger problems than my movies." Ryan raised an eyebrow. He wasn't expecting Clint to be so direct, so composed, but he wasn't about to back down. "Okay, but let's talk specifics," Ryan said, glancing at his notes. Take a film like Gran Torino. A lot of people loved it, sure, but others said it leaned into stereotypes and painted a picture of masculinity that's, well, toxic. The idea that a man has to be tough, stoic, and solve problems with violence. Don't you think that's a dangerous message to send, especially to younger audiences? Clint's lips curled into a slight smirk. Ryan, I think you're confusing toughness with strength. There's a difference. Being tough is about putting up a front, pretending you're invincible. Strength is about standing firm in your principles, even when it's hard. Gran Torino wasn't about glorifying violence. It was about redemption, about a man learning to see beyond his own prejudices and finding a way to do the right thing. If people missed that, maybe they weren't paying attention. If you agree with Clint's timeless values and want to hear more stories like this, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss an episode. Your support helps us keep these conversations alive. For a moment, Ryan was silent. Clint's words had landed harder than he expected. But Ryan wasn't done yet. He leaned forward, his tone growing more serious. All right, I'll give you that. But let's zoom out a bit. You've been pretty open about your conservative views, faith, family, patriotism. Don't you think those ideas feel a little out of place in today's world? I mean, we're living in a time where inclusivity and progress are the focus. Do you ever feel like you're clinging to a past that's no longer relevant? Clint's expression didn't change. Ryan, the world's always changing. That's nothing new. But some things don't go out of style, like integrity, hard work, and taking responsibility for your own life. Those aren't just conservative values. They're human values. And if we lose sight of them in the name of progress, we're not moving forward. We're just losing our way. The room fell silent. Ryan glanced at his notes, searching for his next question, but for the first time, he looked unsure. Clint's words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ryan shifted in his chair, his confidence shaken, but not broken. He wasn't used to being on the defensive, especially not with someone like Clint Eastwood. But Clint's calm demeanor and sharp responses had thrown him off balance. Still, Ryan wasn't about to let the conversation slip away. All right, Clint, Ryan said, leaning forward. I hear what you're saying. Integrity, hard work, responsibility. Those are great values. But don't you think it's a little simplistic to say that everyone just needs to pull themselves up by their bootstraps? What about people who are held back by systemic issues? Not everyone has the same opportunities, and sometimes hard work just isn't enough. Clint nodded slightly, as if he'd heard this argument 100 times before. Ryan, I'm not saying life's fair. It's not. Some folks start with more, and some start with less. But the question is, what do you do with what you've got? You can spend your life blaming the system, or you can figure out how to work around it. I've seen people do incredible things with nothing but grit and determination. That's the kind of story I believe in. Ryan frowned, clearly unsatisfied. But don't you think that mindset ignores the bigger picture? The fact that some people are stuck in cycles of poverty or discrimination? It's not just about individual effort. It's about changing the system so that everyone has a fair shot. Clint leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. Ryan, I'm not saying the system's perfect. But here's the thing. Systems don't change because people sit around complaining about them. They change because individuals step up and do something about it. You want to make the world better? Start with yourself. Be the kind of person who inspires others to do the same. That's how real change happens. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but Clint wasn't finished. And let me tell you something else, Clint continued. I've been around long enough to see a lot of so-called progress. Some of it's been good, no doubt about it. But a lot of it, it's just noise. People chasing trends, trying to tear down everything that came before them without stopping to think about what they're building in its place. You want to talk about fairness? How about we start by teaching people to take pride in their work, to respect their families, to stand for something bigger than themselves? That's the kind of progress we need. The room was silent for a moment. Ryan glanced at his producer, who was standing off camera, gesturing for him to keep the conversation going. "Okay," Ryan said finally, "but let's talk about your films again. You've been accused of perpetuating harmful stereotypes, especially when it comes to race and gender. Do you think Hollywood has a responsibility to be more inclusive and progressive in the stories it tells?" Clint's expression didn't change. "Hollywood has a responsibility to tell the truth. That's what storytelling is about, truth. And the truth isn't always pretty, Ryan. It's not always comfortable, but it's real. You want to make movies that inspire people? Start by showing them the world as it is, not as you wish it were. That's what I've always tried to do." Ryan shook his head. "But don't you think that kind of thinking just reinforces the status quo? Shouldn't we be using art to push boundaries, to challenge people, to think differently?" Clint smiled faintly. "Ryan, I've been pushing boundaries my whole career. But here's the thing. Pushing boundaries doesn't mean tearing everything down. It means building on what came before, taking the best of it and making it better. You can't do that if you're too busy trying to rewrite the past to fit your own agenda." Ryan leaned back in his chair, clearly frustrated. "So you're saying we should just accept the way things are? That we shouldn't try to change the world for the better?" Clint shook his head. "No, Ryan. I'm saying we should change the world by being better, by living with integrity, by working hard, by taking responsibility for our own lives. You want to inspire people? Show them what that looks like. That's what I've tried to do with my films, and if some people don't like it, well, that's their problem, not mine." Ryan stared at Clint, his mind racing. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, especially not by someone who spoke with such quiet confidence. For the first time, he found himself questioning his own assumptions. The conversation was far from over, but Ryan could feel the tide beginning to turn. Clint wasn't just defending his views, he was forcing Ryan to confront his own. The tension in the studio was palpable. Ryan Carter, usually the one in control, found himself grappling with Clint Eastwood's calm, unshakable logic. Clint wasn't just answering questions, he was dismantling assumptions one by one. Ryan adjusted his microphone, trying to regain his footing. "All right, Clint," he said, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "Let's shift gears for a moment. You've talked a lot about personal responsibility and hard work, but don't you think that kind of thinking can come across as dismissive? I mean, there are people out there who are struggling. Single parents, people working 2 or 3 jobs just to get by. Don't they deserve a little more empathy?" Clint nodded, his expression softening slightly. "Of course they do, Ryan. I've got all the respect in the world for people who are doing their best to make ends meet. But here's the thing. Empathy doesn't mean lowering the bar. It means helping people rise to meet it. You want to help someone? Don't tell them they're a victim. Tell them they're capable of more than they think. That's real empathy." Ryan leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "But what about systemic issues? What about the barriers that keep people from succeeding, no matter how hard they work?" Clint's gaze was steady. "Ryan, I'm not saying those barriers don't exist, but I've seen too many people overcome them to believe they're insurmountable. You know what the real barrier is? The one up here." He tapped his temple. "If you believe you're stuck, you're stuck. But if you believe you can find a way, you'll find a way. That's the kind of mindset we need to be teaching people." Ryan sat back, his arms crossed. "That's easy to say when you've had the kind of success you've had, Clint. But not everyone gets to be a Hollywood legend." Clint chuckled softly. You think I started out as a Hollywood legend? I was a kid from a working-class family. My dad worked in a steel mill. I didn't have any connections, no silver spoon. I worked odd jobs, dug swimming pools, did whatever I had to do to get by. And when I finally got my foot in the door, I worked harder than anyone else to make sure I stayed there. Success isn't about where you start, Ryan. It's about what you're willing to do to get where you want to go. Ryan was quiet for a moment, his expression thoughtful. So you're saying it's all about hard work? Clint shook his head. It's about more than that. It's about character. It's about knowing who you are and what you stand for. It's about being willing to make sacrifices, to do the right thing even when it's not easy. That's what I've tried to show in my films. Not perfect people, but people who are trying to do better. That's what life's about. Ryan glanced at his notes, but for the first time, he didn't seem eager to move on to the next question. Instead, he looked at Clint, his expression almost respectful. Ryan glanced at his notes, but for the first time, he didn't seem eager to move on to the next question. Instead, he looked at Clint, his expression almost respectful. You know, Clint, he said slowly, I didn't expect this conversation to go the way it has. I came in here ready to challenge you, to push back against what I saw as outdated ideas. But I'll admit, you've given me a lot to think about. Clint smiled faintly. That's all I can ask for, Ryan. We don't have to agree on everything. But if we can have a real conversation, if we can listen to each other, maybe we'll both walk away a little wiser. Ryan nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. I think you're right about that. And for what it's worth, I respect the fact that you're willing to stand by your principles, even when they're not popular. That takes guts. Clint's smile widened. Thanks, Ryan. And for what it's worth, I respect the fact that you're willing to ask the tough questions. That takes guts, too. The two men shook hands, and for the first time, the tension in the room seemed to lift. As the camera stopped rolling, Ryan leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. He had started the day expecting to challenge Clint Eastwood, to expose the flaws in his old-fashioned way of thinking. But instead, he had found himself challenged, forced to confront his own assumptions and consider a perspective he had dismissed too quickly. Clint stood, slipping on his leather jacket. Thanks for having me, Ryan. It's been a good talk. Ryan nodded. Yeah, it has. Take care, Clint. As Clint walked out of the studio, Ryan sat in silence, his mind racing. He didn't know what his audience would think of the interview, but one thing was certain. He had learned something today. Sometimes, wisdom doesn't come from shouting the loudest or being the most progressive. Sometimes it comes from listening to someone who's been around long enough to see the world for what it really is. And as Ryan watched Clint Eastwood disappear through the studio doors, he couldn't help but feel a newfound respect for the man and for the values he stood for. Thanks for watching. If Clint's wisdom resonated with you, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. For more stories that celebrate timeless values and real conversations, see you in the next one.